The bright lights of the studio glared against the polished desk as the countdown ticked. America Tonight, one of the most watched primetime talk shows, was about to air live from CNN's Manhattan studio. At the center of the storm, Chris Cuomo, former anchorman, current media heavyweight, and a man who relished confrontation. His opponent, Karoline Leavitt, the youngest White House press secretary in U.S. history, invited as a guest to discuss youth in politics. But everyone in the control room knew it wouldn't be just a discussion. As the show's music faded, Chris leaned forward, voice smooth, smile sharp. "So, Karoline," he said, eyes narrowing, "you've become the poster child for Gen Z conservatism. Some even whisper you might run for president someday. The future president, huh?" He chuckled. "Do you actually believe that?" The audience laughed, some nervously, others mockingly. Karoline didn't smile. She sat upright in her forest green blazer, a small silver cross gleaming faintly around her neck, her fingers gently resting on the edge of the desk. Her expression was calm, but behind her eyes, there was fire. "I believe," she said slowly, "that truth doesn't come with an age limit, and leadership isn't granted by networks or applause lines. It's earned." Chris's grin stiffened. He wasn't expecting resistance, not this early. "You're 27, he interrupted. "You speak in rehearsed lines and tweet like a campaign intern. What real-life experience do you bring to the table? Or is this just an audition?" Karoline's lips pressed into a thin smile. "No, Chris. This isn't an audition. This is a reminder that your era of smirking and dismissing voices like mine is ending." The room fell into a pause, brief but dense with tension. Backstage, the CNN producers exchanged looks. She wasn't reading from notes. She wasn't stuttering. She came prepared to clash. Chris leaned back in his chair, eyes glinting. "Well, this is going to be fun," he said, almost too casually. Karoline turned to the camera, her voice clear. "It's going to be real." The opening segment faded to commercial, but the viewers at home and everyone in the studio knew the storm had only just begun. When the show returned from commercial, the energy had shifted. Chris Cuomo adjusted his tie, clearly rattled by Karoline's calm refusal to play along. He had hosted senators, generals, and CEOs, but few had disarmed him with silence like she had. He forced a smile. "Let's talk policy, shall we?" he said. "Because fiery words make headlines, but the country needs more than slogans." Karoline nodded slightly as if welcoming the escalation. "Agreed," she said. "Let's talk substance." Chris wasted no time. "Let's start with immigration. You defend Trump's border policy, a policy many call cruel and inhumane. Cages, family separations, tear gas at crossings. You support that?" Karoline inhaled slowly. Her voice didn't rise. "I support laws that protect the integrity of this country's borders, Chris. I support a system that prioritizes safety for both Americans and migrants. But I do not support emotional manipulation masquerading as journalism." The jab landed. Chris blinked. "You're accusing me of emotional manipulation?" "I'm stating facts," she said. "Your show aired images of crying children without context. You never mentioned that those photos were from 2014. Under the Obama administration, a visible shift rippled through the audience. Chris opened his mouth, but Karoline continued. "You weaponized emotion to shape a narrative. I'm not here to defend every policy. I'm here to defend truth." Even the cameraman, seasoned from years of political brawls, whispered, "She's flipping it." Chris leaned forward now, voice sharper. "So your truth involves defending a man who called immigrants rapists and told 4 congresswomen of color to go back? Is that the future president you admire?" Karoline didn't flinch. "I admire a leader who brought energy independence, job growth, and the lowest black unemployment rate in U.S. history. I don't defend every word, but I defend every American who finally felt seen." The studio stilled. One woman in the third row leaned forward, whispering to her friend, "She's not cracking." Chris scoffed. "So that's your play? Just dodge and pivot?" "No," Karoline said, eyes locked on his. That's your play. Mine is showing America that the truth still matters, even when it's inconvenient for cable news. It was subtle, but Chris's jaw tightened. He didn't expect the 27-year-old to fight back with facts. He expected her to fold. Karoline sat still, composed. Her cross necklace shimmered under the lights as she waited for his next move, not with fear, but with intent. And for the first time in his career, Chris Cuomo wasn't sure if he had the upper hand. Chris Cuomo leaned back slightly, crossing his arms, letting out a half laugh as if to dismiss Karoline's last comment. But his smile no longer reached his eyes. The room, once confidently his, now carried a different temperature. The crowd was listening, really listening. He tried to recover the rhythm. Okay, Karoline, let's say you get what you want, a country run by people who think like you. What happens to unity? What happens to compromise? Karoline didn't blink. Compromise? She echoed softly. Chris, your version of compromise is conservatives apologizing for existing. The audience murmured, some in surprise, others in approval. You want to talk about unity? She continued, voice gaining weight. Unity doesn't mean silence. It doesn't mean pretending we all agree. Unity means allowing different voices to speak without being mocked for believing in God, in the Constitution, in tradition. Chris raised an eyebrow, sensing a trap and still walking straight into it. You think you're mocked for those things? You're in the White House. You speak for the president. You have a platform. Karoline leaned in, calm and deliberate. Yes, I have a platform now. But do you know how many doors were slammed in my face to get here? How many professors rolled their eyes when I said I admired Reagan? How many media producers laughed when I submitted my first op-ed? She paused. The silence was strategic. Then, they weren't laughing when it went viral. A low ripple of applause began, quickly quieted by producers. But the damage was done. The audience was leaning closer to her now, emotionally, if not physically. Chris smirked again, trying to flip it. So you're saying you're a victim? Karoline shook her head. I'm saying I'm a fighter. And I'm not fighting for airtime. I'm fighting for every young woman who's been told she's too bold, too Republican, or too young to be taken seriously. That line struck deeper than any statistic. It wasn't just words. It was a mirror. One young girl in the audience, maybe 16, turned to her mother and whispered, "She sounds like me." Backstage, CNN's producers debated cutting to commercial, sensing the tide turning. But Chris wasn't done. Not yet. He leaned forward again, forcing a grin. You know what? You're polished. I'll give you that. But you sound rehearsed, like every sentence was built for Twitter. Karoline's expression didn't change, but her eyes, sharp, cool, flashed for a moment. I'm not rehearsed, she replied. I'm ready. There's a difference. Even Chris couldn't hide the flicker of surprise in his eyes. She had just taken his insult and turned it into a weapon. And in doing so, she shifted the momentum entirely. The cameras caught it. The momentary blink, the slight shift in Chris Cuomo's posture, the hesitation just before he looked down at his notes. He'd been in the media game for decades, but Karoline Leavitt had done something that shook even him. She'd taken control of the room without raising her voice once. Chris cleared his throat. Okay, he said, voice tighter now. Let's shift to something personal then. You say you're fighting for the people, that you represent their voice. But how many Americans can relate to someone who's been groomed in the White House, who has never faced real-world hardship? Karoline's expression didn't budge. I grew up in a working-class home in New Hampshire, Chris, she said. My father worked 12-hour shifts to make sure we had dinner. I went to a public school that barely had a functioning heater in winter. And when I applied to my first internship in Washington, I slept on a friend's couch because I couldn't afford rent. Her voice didn't crack, but there was steel in it. So, don't talk to me about the real world. I didn't inherit influence. I earned every inch of this seat. A few audience members nodded silently. One older man murmured, She's lived it. Chris tried to regain footing. Still, you defend a president who's been accused of dividing America. How do you reconcile that with this talk of unity and service? Karoline looked directly at him now, her voice even, her gaze unmoving. Division didn't start with President Trump. It started when the media decided that certain beliefs, faith, patriotism, tradition, were dangerous. It started when journalists picked sides instead of telling the story straight. She leaned forward slightly. You don't get to throw a match and then blame the fire, Chris. Gasps echoed softly from the crowd. Chris leaned back, caught in the backlash of his own tactic. So the press is the enemy? Karoline shook her head. Number. But when the press chooses narrative over truth, it becomes one. That line cut deep. In the control room, a CNN executive whispered, "We're losing this segment." Online, the reaction was immediate. Clips began surfacing on X. You don't get to throw a match and blame the fire. Leavitt's Cuomo. She didn't flinch. Karoline folded her hands on the desk. The cross necklace glinted again in the studio lights. I didn't come here to argue with someone reading headlines, she said. I came here to speak for people who feel erased, and if that makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's time you asked yourself why. Chris didn't answer immediately. And in that pause, America watched something happen that no one expected. The seasoned media veteran had been outmaneuvered by a 27-year-old woman armed only with calm, conviction, and the truth. The tension inside the studio had shifted from performance to reckoning. Every movement, every glance, every pause was now under a microscope. Chris Cuomo, usually the master of narrative flow, now looked like a man attempting to steer a boat against the tide. And Karoline? She didn't even look like she was trying. I'll give you this, Chris said, his tone coated with a defensive edge. You're composed. You know your talking points, but let's not pretend you're some outsider. You've been inside the White House echo chamber for years. Karoline's voice remained even. Being close to power doesn't make you part of the problem, she said. It gives you the chance to challenge it, if you're strong enough. The words hung there like a dare. Chris didn't blink. He fired back. You challenge nothing. You repeat Trump's lines, defend his chaos, and now you're trying to wear poise like it's a moral badge. Karoline leaned forward. Just enough. You want chaos, Chris? Try being a conservative college student in a room full of professors who mock your beliefs. Try defending your family's values while your classmates label you a threat. I've known chaos, and I've learned to rise above it without whining. The studio, once held tightly in Chris's grasp, was visibly splitting. On one side, the diehard progressives crossed their arms. On the other, viewers leaned forward, drawn in, not by fire, but by focus. You're framing yourself as a victim, Chris said flatly. Karoline smiled faintly. No, I'm just reminding people that courage doesn't come from agreeing with everyone in the room. It comes from standing when you know they want you to sit. That line landed hard. Behind the scenes, a CNN producer whispered to another, "We need to control this before she becomes the headline." But it was too late. Karoline turned to the camera, not to Chris, not to the crowd, but directly to the American people watching. I don't expect everyone to agree with me, but I dare you to listen, just for a moment, to someone who doesn't speak from a script, but from experience. Even Chris couldn't break in. His show had become her platform. Then came the twist no one expected. A voice from the audience, a middle-aged man in a Union jacket, stood up. She's right, he said, his voice rough, worn. I don't care who you vote for, but she's telling the truth, and I haven't heard that here in a long time. Applause rippled, not wild, but real. Karoline turned back to Chris, expression calm. You wanted a show, Chris. I came to start a conversation. Chris looked directly at her. For the first time that night, he didn't respond with sarcasm or deflection. He just nodded. And in that tiny motion, everything changed. By the time the next commercial break hit, the control room was in quiet chaos. The executive producer leaned over to an assistant and hissed, "We were supposed to let Cuomo dominate this segment. She just flipped it." Online, things were worse, or better, depending on where you stood. Clips of Karoline's line, You don't get to throw a match and blame the fire. We're now flooding X. The hashtag Leavitt takes the mic had overtaken the show's official one. Even some liberal-leaning users wrote, "She came prepared. That's not a puppet, that's a problem solver." Back on stage, Chris Cuomo tried to pivot. He smiled again, but this time it looked rehearsed. "Let's bring it back to your so-called future. There's a buzz around you, Karoline. They say you're eyeing higher office, maybe even the presidency one day." He laughed. "The future president, huh? Do you actually believe that?" This time, the laughter didn't echo as loudly. Some even stiffened. Karoline didn't flinch. "I don't need to believe it," she replied. "I just need to work for it. Because the people I represent, hardworking, God-fearing, freedom-loving Americans, they don't care about dynasties or name brands. They care about someone who listens." Chris leaned in, voice firmer. "But do you think someone your age can handle a nation this divided?" Karoline's response was immediate and devastating. "I think someone from my generation has to," she said. "Because those who came before us, who sat in seats like yours, divided it in the first place." It was an accusation, a reckoning, and a promise all in one. The audience didn't cheer. They paused. Because the truth wasn't meant to entertain. It was meant to challenge. Chris opened his mouth, but Karoline kept going. "People are tired, Chris. Tired of the spin, the drama, the insults. They want someone who doesn't talk down to them, who doesn't assume they're too uneducated to understand inflation or border policy." She looked around the studio. "They want someone who sees them." That's when a woman in the front row, mid-40s, jeans and a teacher's badge, stood and clapped once, then again and again. The crowd followed. A slow build standing ovation in the middle of a CNN primetime broadcast. Chris looked around. His jaw clenched. He had hosted presidents, senators, entertainers, but this wasn't a guest segment anymore. This was a passing of the mic, and he hadn't seen it coming. The standing ovation didn't fade quickly. It rolled through the studio like a slow-moving storm. Not frantic, but intentional. Some clapped out of respect, others out of realization. A few remained seated, arms crossed, not because they disagreed, but because they didn't know what to do with what they'd just witnessed. Karoline stood calmly, not bowing, not milking the moment. She simply turned toward the crowd, meeting their applause with a gaze that said, "I hear you too." Chris Cuomo sat back in his chair, trying to regain composure. "Well," he said, forcing a grin, "you're good at theater, I'll give you that." Karoline tilted her head. "No, Chris. Theater is when someone pretends to be something they're not." "I'm not pretending." He narrowed his eyes. "So you're saying I am?" Karoline didn't answer directly. She didn't have to. The audience could draw their own conclusions now. Backstage, an assistant producer turned to the lead editor. "Should we cut this part for replays?" The editor shook his head. "Are you kidding? This is the only thing people will talk about tomorrow." Back on set, Chris tried to push into policy again. Healthcare, taxes, climate. But the rhythm was off. Karoline answered every question not like a pundit, but like someone who had lived the debate, not just memorized it. "You keep bringing up the past," she said. "But the past doesn't fix the present. We can honor it, we can learn from it, but if we stay stuck in it, we lose the future." Her tone softened then, just slightly. "My generation didn't break this country, but we're the ones who will have to rebuild it, whether your side lets us or not." Chris frowned. "So you want a political revolution?" Karoline gave a half smile. I want a political restoration. Back to truth. Back to service. Back to leadership that doesn't start with insults and end with applause." The crowd responded with quiet intensity, nods, murmurs, deepened breaths. They weren't being entertained. They were being moved, and the camera caught it all. Online, the numbers exploded. She didn't attack, she exposed. Leavitt 2028, trending alongside Cuomo collapse. A side-by-side video comparing Chris's sarcasm to Karoline's poise hit 2.4 million views in an hour. But inside the studio, Karoline remained steady. She had no script, no teleprompter, no team in her ear, just her voice, her story, and the kind of quiet power that didn't demand the room, but earned it. The studio had become quieter, not from lack of energy, but from gravity. Something about the tone had shifted. Chris Cuomo knew it too. His usual confidence had been chipped away piece by piece. He still had time, still had the platform. But Karoline Leavitt wasn't just holding her own anymore. She was defining the space. He leaned forward again, a slight edge returning to his voice. "All right then," he said. "Let me ask you something plainly. No spin. Do you really think you're going to be president one day?" The way he said it wasn't a genuine question. It was a challenge, an accusation wrapped in a smirk. Some in the audience laughed. Others held their breath. Karoline didn't look at Chris. She looked straight into the camera and smiled. "Maybe," she said. "Maybe not. But if I don't try, someone who thinks faith is weakness, that tradition is oppression, and that freedom is negotiable, will." A hush settled across the room. Then she turned to Chris calmly. "You think the presidency is too big for me? You think I should wait my turn? That someone like me should only speak when spoken to?" He opened his mouth, but nothing came. Karoline's voice dropped to something deeper, almost intimate. "I've watched men like you my whole life. You speak with certainty, act with charm, and assume the future belongs to people who already have power." Her hand rested gently on the desk. "But here's what you don't get. My generation doesn't want power handed to us. We're here to build something new, while you cling to what's fading." The studio audience shifted again. Some stood, not cheering, just standing. Quiet reverence. It wasn't about sides anymore. It was about who was speaking truth. Backstage, a CNN intern sent a message to a friend at MSNBC. "This isn't a guest spot anymore, it's a takeover." Chris tried once more. "You don't think experience matters?" Karoline looked at him. Not angry, not smug, just honest. "I think experience without humility becomes arrogance. And I think arrogance is why this country's in trouble." Boom. That line wasn't just heard, it was felt. And across the nation, screens lit up with new clips. A headline on X read, "Karoline Leavitt just redefined what leadership looks like." And for the first time, Chris Cuomo, a man who prided himself on always having the last word, sat in silence. Chris Cuomo's shoulders tensed. The atmosphere on set wasn't hostile. It was humbling. The crowd wasn't chanting, but they were listening, really listening. Something no one on his team had predicted. The plan was to press her, challenge her, maybe shake her confidence. But Karoline hadn't just stood her ground. She had shifted the earth beneath it. Chris tried to rally. "You've made some compelling points," he said. "But come on. Leadership isn't about sound bites. It's about service, responsibility, depth." Karoline nodded. "Exactly. And that's why I came here tonight. To serve the truth." She didn't blink. "You think this is about ambition? About headlines or trending tags? It's not. I came here because people who think like me, middle class, faith-driven, unapologetically American, are tired of being mocked, mislabeled, or erased." The silver cross around her neck caught the light. "I didn't choose politics for power. I chose it because I watched my community get ignored, my beliefs ridiculed, and my generation told to shut up and scroll." She looked at the audience, then back at Chris. "We're not scrolling anymore." The audience reacted not with applause, but with silence, the kind that follows a statement so raw it doesn't need reaction. Chris leaned back, arms crossed tightly, but his smile was gone. "You think your passion makes up for experience?" he said, almost whispering now. Karoline took a breath. "Number. But I think your experience has blinded you to passion, and that's more dangerous than inexperience ever could be." He opened his mouth to respond, but again, there was nothing. No witty comeback, no sarcastic jab, just a pause that felt like surrender. Backstage, the control room froze. The host had lost the tempo. The guest had claimed the narrative. Online, it was already over. Karoline Leavitt didn't debate. She dismantled. Cuomo collapse, now trending above his own show's name. A clip of Karoline saying, "We're not scrolling anymore," hit 3.1 million views in 30 minutes. Even a progressive journalist tweeted, "Whether you agree or not, she came to speak, and she spoke louder than anyone ever has in that seat." Karoline turned to the audience, voice calm. "I don't claim to have all the answers, but I'm not afraid of the questions." Then she looked back at Chris. "Are you?" And just like that, what was supposed to be a spotlight for Cuomo had become a stage he could no longer control. The cameras kept rolling, but Chris Cuomo had gone still. His polished persona, honed by years of anchoring primetime debates, seemed to waver, not from rage, but from realization. He had lost the studio, and worse, he had lost the room's respect. Karoline Leavitt, still seated, leaned forward slightly. The cross around her neck remained visible, a quiet symbol that had outshined all the lights, all the applause, all the scripts. "This isn't about me," she said softly. "It never was. I didn't come here to win a fight. I came to make something clear. America isn't looking for another polished politician. It's looking for someone who doesn't flinch when it matters." Chris cleared his throat. He tried to jump in, to salvage what was left. But Karoline raised one hand, just slightly. "And you asked earlier," she continued, "if I believe I could be president one day. I'll say this." She paused. Her voice lowered, but sharpened, like a final chisel against stone. "If I ever sit behind that desk in the Oval Office, I won't owe it to money or media or legacy. I'll owe it to nights like this. To rooms where I wasn't supposed to speak, but did. To people who never saw themselves on this stage. Until now." A long silence. Even Chris couldn't speak. The audience stood, not roaring this time, but rising in something deeper than applause. Recognition, respect, reckoning. Backstage, a CNN producer whispered, "We've never had a moment like this." On social media, the tide became a wave. She didn't just win the argument, she rewrote the format. Karoline takes over. CNN Showdown. Leavitt 2028. The show closed with no wrap-up. Chris simply nodded to the camera, voice subdued. "Thank you for watching. Good night." But America wasn't ready to sleep. Clips spread like wildfire. Editorials were already being drafted. Conservative outlets praised her fire, liberals admitted her precision. Independents asked, "Why haven't we heard her before?" And in a quiet green room down the hall, Karoline sat alone, still in her green jacket, her phone buzzing endlessly. She didn't check it. She didn't need to. She'd said what she came to say. And for the first time in years, a political voice had echoed across party lines, not by shouting, but by standing. Firm, clear, unafraid. Sometimes a stage is more than a place for debate. It becomes a moment of transformation. That night, Karoline Leavitt didn't just respond to Chris Cuomo. She defended every value under fire. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the bar. In the face of condescension, she stood with calm conviction. In a room that wasn't hers, she took ownership, not with anger, but with truth. This wasn't about a win. It was about a warning. A new generation is rising, grounded in faith, sharpened by experience, and unafraid to speak. Karoline didn't ask for permission. She claimed her place. And for millions watching, it was the moment they realized. The future no longer belongs to those who mock from behind a desk. It belongs to those who dare to lead.